The crowd laughed when the noise broke the silence of the train car, but the smile didn't last long. It had started as an ordinary evening commute. The Amtrak car rattled in its familiar rhythm, fluorescent lights humming overhead. A handful of tired passengers sunk into their seats. The air smelled of reheated coffee and damp coats. People scrolled on their phones, dozed against windows, or whispered in low voices, waiting for the slow miles to pass. Among them, one man sat almost unnoticed in a corner booth. Denim shirt, worn leather boots, a quiet posture that blended him into the background. Chuck Norris. Most hadn't realized it yet. Without cameras or lights, he looked like any other older traveler riding home. His eyes were half closed, his hands folded loosely on his lap, the faintest shadow of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The piece cracked when a group of young men stumbled into the car from the one ahead. They were loud from the start, beer on their breath, laughter pitched too high, voices bouncing off the metal walls. One of them, taller than the rest, carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed the whole room owed him attention. He scanned the car quickly, smirked, then stopped when his gaze landed on Norris. He leaned toward his friends and said something under his breath that made them chuckle. Then, louder, so the car could hear, "Well, look at this. Isn't that Chuck Norris? Or just some old guy pretending to be him?" A few heads turned. Passengers who had been dozing straightened. Phones tilted, already recording. The tension in the air thickened, half amusement, half unease. Norris didn't move. His eyes remained closed. The corner of his mouth twitched, not in irritation, but in the way someone might react to a fly buzzing nearby. The man stepped closer. His voice rose. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? I thought Chuck Norris was supposed to be a fighter. Guess the movies lied." His friends broke into drunken laughter, slapping their thighs. A couple of passengers joined in nervously, as if laughter could shield them from whatever was brewing. Others shook their heads, uneasy, murmuring for him to sit down. The tension spread like static through the car. Still Norris remained motionless. The young man's smile faltered for a beat, then returned sharper, crueler. He leaned toward an older woman in the seat ahead. "Don't worry, ma'am," he said, pointing at Norris. "If this old cowboy gets out of line, I'll protect you." His friends howled again, but the woman's face tightened, lips pressed in a hard line. The crowd became the third character in the story. Every movement, the clink of bottles, the faint squeak of shoes against the aisle floor, echoed louder than it should have. People glanced at each other, silently asking, "Is this going too far?" A man near the back whispered to his wife, "That really is him. It's Chuck Norris." The whisper rippled like a secret, spreading row by row. The young man, emboldened, bent closer to Norris. His voice turned mocking, his words sharp. "Tell me, old man, those punches in your movies, ever land one in real life? Or were they just for Hollywood?" He reached out a hand, hovered it just inches from Norris's shoulder, teasing contact. The car collectively stiffened. Someone coughed, the sound snapping in the silence like a twig. Norris finally opened his eyes. Just that. Two pale blue irises meeting the younger man's gaze. The laughter died instantly. There was no anger in the stare, no challenge, just a calm that felt heavier than violence. It was the look of someone who didn't need to prove anything. The aggressor faltered. His grin slipped, though he tried to mask it with another bark of laughter. "Come on, don't just sit there. Show us what you've got, movie star." Phones lifted higher. A child peeked over the back of a seat, eyes wide, clutching his mother's sleeve. The woman crossed herself under her breath. Norris said nothing. His silence cut deeper than any insult could. The young man's face flushed, frustration seeping through. He took a louder tone, shouting, "See? He's nothing. Just an old man riding a train." The words bounced around the car, ugly and hollow. Some passengers jeered, egging him on out of fear or nervous thrill. Others glared at him with open contempt. The division sharpened. And still, Norris sat quiet. That stillness was unbearable. The younger man's voice cracked as he tried again. "What's wrong, Chuck?" Too scared to answer. The train rumbled over a joint in the tracks, the sound booming like a drum roll. The lights flickered for a fraction of a second. The atmosphere thickened further, almost unbreathable. Then, with deliberate slowness, Norris lifted his head fully and met the young man's eyes again. His voice, when it finally came, was low and steady. Respect isn't a game, he said. You'll learn that one way or another. The words sliced the air clean in half. For a moment, even the train itself seemed to hush. The man's friends stopped laughing. Passengers shifted forward in their seats. Phones zoomed closer. The aggressor's smile died completely. He clenched his jaw, muttering something under his breath, but his body betrayed him, shoulders tightening, fists half closing, feet shuffling for stability. The moment stretched taut as wire. Everyone knew it couldn't hold forever. And then, in a flash of frustration, the young man reached out, gripping Norris by the shoulder. The entire car froze. Breaths held. Eyes widened. The tension had snapped, and something irreversible was about to begin. Just wondering, where are you watching from? Write it down, Bello. The grip on Norris's shoulder was casual, almost lazy, but everyone in the train car felt the violation. It wasn't just a touch, it was a claim. Fingers pressed just firmly enough to declare ownership of the moment. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, the steel wheels clattered in rhythm against the track joints, but none of it covered the sound of silence that fell over the passengers. The young man's friends leaned into the aisle, their laughter echoing too loudly, like stage actors playing to a crowd. They wanted this scene to spiral. Phones rose higher, small red lights recording. A teenager angled his camera for the best shot, shaking with excitement. Across the aisle, a woman pulled her child closer and whispered something too soft to hear. The boy stared, wide-eyed, caught between fear and awe. See that? The aggressor crowed, stepping back just enough to make sure everyone was watching. He tapped the back of his hand against his jeans as if brushing off dirt. Nothing, just an old man sitting there. His voice dripped with the fake confidence of someone who needed witnesses to believe his own story. His friends cackled in approval, but the rest of the car stayed quiet. Norris didn't flinch. His eyes remained lowered, breath slow and steady, as if none of this mattered. His body gave nothing away. No anger, no reaction, no hint of weakness. The stillness was unnerving. The aggressor tried to drag the spotlight wider. He pointed at a businessman in a wrinkled suit. What about you, Mr. Wall Street? Think this cowboy could last a second against me? The man in the suit raised his palms, shaking his head, pretending to be invisible. He turned toward a teenager with headphones. You want a picture with your hero here? Maybe he'll sign your backpack. The boy hesitated, pulled the headphones down, and in a shaky but clear voice said, "Leave him alone." The air thickened. That single sentence carried more weight than all the laughter. Passengers shifted uneasily. The young man's grin sharpened into something cruel. "Cute," he said, taking a half step toward the boys' row. His friends hooped, emboldening him further. The conductor appeared in the doorway, knit cap pulled low, eyes heavy from too many shifts spent breaking up drunks. His voice was calm, measured. "Sir, take your seat." The aggressor didn't even look back. "Relax," he said, spreading his arms as though he were doing a show. "Just having fun. Everyone's so uptight." His grin widened, but it rang hollow. "We good?" The silence answered for them. He pivoted back to Norris. "So, Chuck, tell the kid how it works. Punches that stop an inch from the face, right? Movie magic." He pantomimed, throwing a slow-motion punch, making sound effects with his lips. His friends laughed, but it sounded strained, now forced. The rest of the car stayed silent. Norris still didn't react. His quiet was heavier than any insult. He looked out the window at the fields dissolving into night, his expression distant, unreadable. The man's frustration mounted. He leaned in close, breath sour with beer and cologne. "You know what the worst part is? You made people think they could fight. Then they meet someone like me." With that, he reached out and flicked the brim of Norris's cap upward with 2 fingers, a schoolyard taunt. Gasps rippled through the car. The conductor stepped forward a pace, stopped, calculating whether he was about to need backup. "Last warning," the conductor said, voice firmer now. "Hey, if he's really Chuck Norris," the man said loudly, "he doesn't need your help." He turned his head toward the other passengers. "This is where the myth ends, people. Real life starts here." He puffed out his chest, feeding off the eyes on him. One of his friends filmed from a low angle, hoping to capture the humiliation. And then Norris moved. Slowly, deliberately, he straightened in his seat. No sudden motion, no raised fists. Just a shift in posture, the line from his shoulders to his hips tightening, aligning. His hands remained folded on his lap. The young man's grin wavered. Something primal flickered in his chest, a feeling he didn't want to name. It was the same feeling a stray dog gets when it realizes the quiet figure it barked at isn't moving away. A woman whispered, "Don't," though she wasn't sure to whom. The aggressor spread his arms, forcing bravado. "Come on, Chuck. Hit me. Show the kid a move. Or just sit there and prove you're done." The pause grew unbearable. The silence pressed against everyone's skin. Someone in the back muttered, "All right," under his breath, like he was preparing for impact. Desperate to finish what he had started, the young man grabbed a cup from his friend, took a gulp, and flicked the remaining liquid at Norris's boots. The splash hit, bitter coffee scent filling the air. The crowd winced as one. The conductor's voice cut through, "Sir," sharp now, but ignored. The aggressor leaned forward, pointing at the boy again. "Watch, champ. This is what happens when old myths meet reality." His hand shot out, aiming to shove Norris's shoulder, to mark him, to prove himself to this captive audience. And then Norris looked up. The movement was glacial but undeniable. His eyes, pale and steady, locked onto the younger man's face. No anger, no smirk, just a cold, unblinking focus that read him completely. Weight off balance, breath shallow, bravado cracking. The man froze. His hand hovered inches from the shoulder it was meant to shove. Every ounce of noise drained from the car. Even the train's wheels seemed to hush. Passengers leaned forward without realizing it. The boy's mother missed her son's hoodie as she reached for it, hands trembling. "You don't want this," Norris said. Calm. Flat. A truth, not a threat. The words landed like a hammer on wet stone. The aggressor flinched. But pride, stung and bleeding, pushed him forward. He forced a laugh, brittle and hollow, and dropped his palm toward Norris's shoulder. Every chest in the car tightened. The fluorescent bulbs hummed. Outside, the windows reflected only faces staring back at themselves. The shove began its descent, and in that heartbeat, the entire train car seemed to stop moving. The shove never landed clean. It hovered in the narrow space between intent and regret, caught in air that had turned thick as tar. The train clattered on, wheels beating their rhythm against steel, but inside the car the sound barely reached. Passengers leaned forward, not breathing, watching a moment stretch far longer than it should. Norris's eyes rose, slow and deliberate, until they locked on the younger man. There was no anger in them, no threat, but they carried the quiet weight of a man who'd spent a lifetime learning not to blink first. The gaze froze the younger man's arm halfway through the motion, his palm suspended inches from the shoulder it had meant to shove. He tried to grin, but the corners of his mouth twitched wrong, betraying nerves. Phones tilted higher. The little red recording lights felt almost obscene in their eagerness, capturing a man trapped between bravado and collapse. A boy in a hoodie, clutching the edge of his seat, whispered to his mother, "He's not moving." She hushed him, though her own eyes never left the two men. The aggressor coughed out a laugh. "What's the matter, Chuck? Gonna stare me into the hospital?" His voice cracked on the last word. He tried to mask it by straightening his shoulders, but the sound had already told the truth. Norris didn't reply. He turned his head slightly toward the window, watching his reflection blur into the night beyond, fields rushing past, swallowed by darkness. His face looked older in the glass, the lines deeper, but it was a face comfortable with silence. The younger man pulled his hand back, stuffed it into his pocket like nothing had happened. "See?" he announced too loudly. "He's scared to touch me." A couple of his friends clapped, half-hearted and embarrassed. The rest of the car stayed quiet. That silence pressed harder than any jeer. Even the conductor, edging closer, seemed uncertain whether to intervene. "Sir, return to your seat," he said evenly. The aggressor didn't even glance his way. He needed the crowd. He needed the stage. He leaned closer to Norris, breath thick with beer. "You fooled people. Made them think they could fight. But you're just..." His fingers flicked the brim of Norris's cap. Gasps rippled across the car. The act was small, childish even, but it was enough to turn the audience against him. "Don't," a woman said softly from the back. Her voice barely carried, but it was sharp enough to cut through. The man laughed louder, desperate to drown her out. "Come on, Chuck. Say something. Hit me. Show these people the legends still got teeth." He spread his arms like a performer daring the magician's trick. His eyes, though, betrayed the act. They flicked nervously, looking for approval and finding none. And then Norris spoke. Just one word. Stop. It wasn't loud, but the syllable dropped into the air with the weight of a stone hitting still water. The ripples silenced even the friends with their phones raised. The boy in the hoodie felt the hairs on his arms lift. The conductor stopped mid-step. The younger man blinked hard, unsettled. Or what? He asked, but it came out quieter, curiosity slipping beneath his sneer. The mask cracked for half a second. Everyone saw it. You don't want this, Norris said. Calm. Certain. It wasn't a warning, it was a fact. The car shifted. People looked at each other, sensing something beyond the surface. The aggressor flushed red, cornered by his own pride. He needed to finish this before the silence swallowed him. His hand shot out again, sharper this time. Not a shove, but a snatch at Norris's collar. The car gasped as one. A can rolled under his seat and rattled, the sound unnervingly loud. Children whimpered. Even the phones shook as hands trembled. But the grip never found what it wanted. Norris had moved, barely, an inch of space, a fraction of timing. Enough to turn certainty into failure. The younger man's hand closed on cloth, but the motion felt wrong, late, hollow. His balance tipped forward, his body betraying him. Norris's gaze didn't waver. For the first time, a thin edge of steel entered it. Not anger, but the simple assurance of someone who knows the ground he stands on. You think you're stronger, Norris said quietly, almost kindly. But strength without control is just noise. The words struck harder than any blow. The aggressor's chest heaved, his fists tightened, but the fight had already drained out of him. His friends muttered, uncomfortable, their laughter long gone. And yet, unable to retreat without losing face, the younger man lunged again. Harder, reckless, desperate to claw back the image he'd lost. The car leaned with him. Passengers clutched seats. Someone whispered a prayer. The mother's hand tightened on her son's shoulder. The fingers closed once more on denim, jerking at Norris's collar. The entire train car froze, drawn into that single violent pull, suspended in the breathless space between cause and consequence. Time narrowed to a thread. The reflection in the dark window showed two faces, one calm, one contorted. The moment had finally arrived. The shove never landed. Instead, Norris's hand rose almost lazily, fingers finding the man's wrist with the precision of someone reaching for something he already owned. No theatrics, no sudden violence, just a calm, precise grip. It looked ordinary from the outside. To the man trapped in it, it was a lock he couldn't pick. Gasps tore through the train car. A woman clapped her hand over her mouth, nearly dropping her coffee. A teenager filming whispered, "No way," his phone shaking as if his own hands couldn't believe what they'd caught. For an instant, the entire carriage seemed suspended between awe and disbelief. The aggressor yanked, twisted, shoved his shoulder forward. Nothing. The harder he pulled, the weaker he looked. Muscles swelled, jaw tightened, sneakers squeaked on the floor, but the wrist stayed exactly where Norris wanted it. The difference between noise and control had never looked so stark. Norris's face didn't change. No sweat, no anger. He looked into the man's eyes, not at the arm he held, and spoke low enough that the whole car still heard. Strength isn't humiliating weaker people. That isn't strength at all. The words struck harder than any punch. Passengers shifted, some nodding without realizing it. A man in a suit muttered, "Amen," under his breath. The mood in the car flipped. The crowd that had been waiting for spectacle now understood they were witnessing something else. A lesson delivered in silence and certainty. The trapped man's friends tried to laugh, but their voices faltered. One of them muttered, "Let him go," but didn't dare move closer. Even the conductor stood still, radio in hand, as if afraid to interrupt the gravity of what had become a public reckoning. The aggressor tried again, desperation creeping in. His arm jerked, his shoulder rolled, but his wrist obeyed Norris, not him. Panic flickered in his eyes, not from pain, but from the terrifying realization that he was no longer in control. The train itself seemed to lean in, the metal groan of the tracks underscoring his failure. Then Norris released him. Just like that. The grip opened, and the young man staggered back half a step, clutching his arm as though it no longer belonged to him. The release was more humiliating than a strike could have been. It wasn't that Norris couldn't hurt him. It was that he had chosen not to. Phones caught the image, a red-faced man panting, trembling, staring at his own hand while the calm figure opposite him sat as if nothing had happened. The contrast was unbearable. The boy in the hoodie clapped suddenly, 3 sharp beats. Other children joined, their applause raw and unfiltered. The sound spread, awkward but undeniable, filling the silence. The aggressor's friends shrank into their seats, avoiding the eyes of strangers. Their earlier laughter had evaporated. The swagger they'd arrived with dripped away under the heat of a crowd that now saw them for what they were. The man himself tried to recover, forcing out words. "Relax, I was just..." The excuse cracked and died halfway. He swallowed, looking smaller with every second. Someone from the back shouted. He froze, and this time the laughter that followed wasn't cruel. It was aimed squarely at him. Norris didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply lowered his hand back to his lap, posture unchanged. His eyes stayed on the man, not accusing, not mocking, just present, offering a truth he couldn't run from. The train swayed into smoother track. Reflections in the dark windows showed a carriage full of faces caught in a moment that felt larger than themselves. Everyone knew. The fight wasn't physical anymore. The decision belonged to the man who had started it. Either he accepted what had just been handed to him, or he tried once more and faced the consequences. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, pressing, waiting. A choice hung there like a coin about to fall, one way or the other. The young man rubbed his wrist as if trying to wake it back into loyalty, but the truth was written across his face. It wasn't the wrist that had betrayed him, it was the story. The swagger, the laughter, the illusion of power, all stripped away in front of strangers. He stood there in the aisle, taller than most, but suddenly diminished, while the train rattled forward into the dark. Norris didn't press the advantage. He simply let silence do its work. His hand rested calmly on his knee, body language saying the choice belonged to the aggressor now. No threat, no gloating, just a mirror. Decide. The friends who had howled with him minutes earlier couldn't look up. One shoved his phone back into his pocket, though the little red recording light still blinked against the fabric. Another whispered something too soft to hear, his face pale, drained of the courage he'd borrowed from the group. Their laughter had evaporated. A child began clapping again, small, hesitant bursts at first. Another joined, then a few more. The sound carried oddly in the carriage, not derisive but sincere, the way children applaud when they sense something has shifted toward safety. That honesty stung sharper than ridicule. The young man flushed crimson, jaw tight, eyes darting for escape. He tried to grin, tried to spin the scene back under his control. "Relax," he said too loudly, his voice cracking. "I was just kidding around." The words landed flat, tinny, like coins hitting a floor. Even his friends wouldn't laugh with him. From the rear, a woman's voice cut through. Calm, clear. "We saw you." Heads turned. A murmur of agreement spread. The young man's mask slipped further. He ran a hand over his face, muttered, "You don't get it." But they did. Everyone did. The conductor hovered nearby, radio still in hand, but he seemed to realize the train itself had chosen sides. He softened his stance and said, "Let's return to our seats." It wasn't an order. It sounded almost like an invitation to dignity, if anyone was brave enough to accept it. Norris remained motionless. His eyes stayed on the man, steady, unblinking, but absent of cruelty. It was an invitation to, "You can step back now, if you want to." The kind of look that offers no escape from truth, but doesn't chain you either. The younger man tried again to laugh, a hollow rasp. "Well, you all got your show right." He jabbed a thumb toward Norris, hoping for a reaction. The legend still got a trick or two. His smile wobbled, then died when the silence returned heavier than before. A boy in a hoodie, emboldened by the quiet, said clearly, "He didn't trick you. He stopped you." His mother reached to hush him, but didn't follow through. She was nodding too. That line cut deeper than any insult. The car's atmosphere shifted again, no longer watching a spectacle, but weighing a verdict. The aggressor's friends shrank further back, jackets pulled tight, eyes on the floor. Someone in the rear shouted. He froze. Laughter erupted, but this time it wasn't cruel. It was collective, a release of tension, and it landed squarely on the man who had swaggered in. He winced at the sound, shoulders curling inward. "Whatever," he muttered, clinging to the only defense pride offered. "You all think you know me?" But the sentence crumbled halfway, unfinished, pointless. The conductor gestured toward an empty seat. "Sit," he said firmly, but not unkindly. The word echoed as both command and mercy. The young man hesitated. Sitting meant it was over. Sitting meant admitting something he wasn't ready to name. His eyes flicked to the door at the end of the car, the one he had stormed through earlier like a conquering hero. Now it looked narrow, almost shameful. Norris finally moved, his palm opening outward, small, steady. The gesture was simple enough. The weight in the room eased, not fully, but enough for people to breathe again. A few passengers shifted back into seats, coffee cups finding holders, bags tucked into corners. The rhythm of the train returned to awareness. The man exhaled loudly, trying to sound bored. "It's done," he announced, pointing vaguely around him. "You wanted drama, you got it. He's a big deal, congratulations." His voice cracked again, a surrender dressed as sarcasm. He lowered himself into the seat across from his friends, the thud of his body against the cushion louder than it should have been. The car exhaled with him. Shoulders dropped. Someone whispered, "Finally." A child laughed in relief. Norris adjusted his jacket, brushed dust from his boot, and turned his eyes back to the window. The reflection of the entire car looked back. Weary commuters, kids still buzzing with adrenaline, strangers bound by a story they hadn't asked for but would never forget. People murmured, some already typing into their phones, uploading shaky clips of what they'd just seen. Chuck Norris shut him down, one muttered. Another whispered, he didn't even hit him. Norris didn't claim the last word. He let the silence remain. And in that silence, everyone understood the fight had already been decided, not by force, but by the man who didn't need to prove anything at all. The young man slouched in his seat, eyes fixed on the floor pattern. His pride fought for scraps, but his body betrayed the truth. He was finished. He rubbed his wrist again, winced, and gave up. Norris turned slightly, met his gaze one more time. His voice was low, calm. "You can be better than this." The words hung there, not heavy but alive, an open door. The man blinked hard, swallowing. For the first time that night, he didn't look angry. He looked lost. And as the train drummed steadily forward, the car leaned into the pause, waiting for what would come next. The carriage was quiet except for the rattle of the tracks. Norris's words still hung there, heavier than the steel rails beneath them. Real strength is stopping harm without becoming it. The young man who had started it all sat hunched forward, rubbing his wrist as though the grip still burned. His face no longer carried the grin he wore like armor. It looked younger, stripped of its mask. He tried to laugh it off. "I was just joking," but his own voice betrayed him. Nobody laughed with him this time. His friends shifted uncomfortably, staring at the floor. Their earlier cheers had vanished, leaving only silence. A phone in one of their hands was still recording, but the boy's thumb hovered over the screen, uncertain now whether to share what he had captured. Across the aisle, a woman pulled her child closer. The boy whispered, "Is it over?" and she nodded. Around them people sat straighter, waiting to see what came next. The conductor loosened his grip on his radio. The crisis, it seemed, had already passed. The young man cleared his throat. "I was wrong," he muttered. The words were flat, stripped of bravado. He looked at the woman he had scared earlier. "I'm sorry." She gave the smallest of nods. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was enough. Norris leaned back in his seat, hands resting easily on his knees. He hadn't moved much at all, but his presence filled the car more than shouting ever could. He turned his head, met the young man's eyes for half a second, and said, calm and low, "You can do better." There was no threat in it, no demand, just a fact spoken plainly. And that was somehow harder to resist. The young man looked down again, shoulders slumping. The train rattled on, the sound of metal on metal filling the silence. Gradually, passengers began to move again, adjusting coats, sipping coffee gone cold, whispering to one another. Someone let out a nervous laugh, and a ripple of relief spread. At the next stop, the doors opened with their usual sigh, letting in cold platform air. A few people stepped off, pausing to glance back at the car as though they didn't want to leave the story unfinished. Those who stayed kept sneaking looks at Norris, waiting for him to say more. He didn't. His silence was the closing line. The young man shifted again. This time he spoke louder, enough for half the car to hear. "Ma'am, I really am sorry." His voice cracked. Heads turned. Some nodded quietly, as though acknowledging the effort itself was something. A child in the back asked, too loudly. Is he a superhero? His mother shook her head, smoothing his hair. No, she whispered. Just a man. The boy seemed content with that. By now, phones were buzzing with alerts. Clips from the train were already online, spreading fast. The captions would focus on the name, Chuck Norris, but those inside the carriage knew it wasn't about that. It was about restraint, about how silence can hold more power than noise. As the city lights began to flicker outside the windows, reflections layered across the glass, the atmosphere shifted again. People sat a little taller. The young man no longer smirked. He looked simply tired, like someone who had dropped a heavy mask. His friends kept their eyes forward, still and pale. When the train slowed for the final station, Norris rose without hurry. He let others move into the aisle first. At the doors he paused, looking down the length of the car, not to collect gratitude, but to be sure calm had returned. Then he stepped out into the cold night and was gone. The passengers stayed behind, whispering to each other in voices hushed but certain. They would tell this story later, over dinner and texts on social media. But for now, they carried it quietly, each knowing they had seen strength that needed no spectacle.